Now, the title of my short contribution is The Challenge of Global History in Higher Education from CLIOHRES to CLIOHWORLD. If CLIOHRES aimed at putting into contact and creating links between national historical narratives mainly concerning EU countries, CLIOHWORLD, by using these experiences, aims at providing guidelines and materials for teaching EU history as a distinct subject and, quote, at providing knowledge of the links with the history of other continents as well. In other quotes of our papers, you'll find for other continents the wider world and other continents. And in the title of the project, you find simply the world. So allow me some remarks, probably not completely new to you. Until recently, world history was just an old established special field of historiography, though rarely a field of research with an institutional basis, and very rare as a subject of teaching programs or specialized courses. The situation is, as you know, different in the United States, where some Western Civ courses have been renamed and revised and are now called world history. The situation is confirmed by our ongoing effort to map the situation concerning world history courses in different countries of the EU. Nowadays, global history has become a growth sector in academic research and even teaching. During the last 20 years, we see literally hundreds of books and articles with global history in the title. Many deal with special subjects: trade, migrations, missions, communications, intercultural encounters, and so on a global scale and under the global perspective. But surprisingly many tackle the difficult question, what is global history, what should global history be, and how is the new global history related to the very old tradition of world history? A few sentences on tradition. When in the 15th century before Christ, Herodotus set out to describe the geography and the histories of the world known to him, the inhabited world of the oikomene, as you know, he claimed to write a world history, and rightly so, because he tried to relate and to synchronize the historical traditions of different peoples and different cultures. The Old Testament is a world history because it has a beginning and an end and gives an account of the history of the various people from the creation along rough geographical lines and primarily along their genealogies. In the Middle Ages, the common term for world history was universal history or universal chronicle, stressing the word universal, stressing that the history of all mankind was to be presented. World histories were the especially popular genre of Christian historiography in medieval Europe, and we know about 200 universal chronicles. These universal chronicles had a rather broad chronological and geographical scope, giving in principle a continuous account of the linear progress of the world from Genesis up to the author's or the compiler's own times, occasionally with some looks in the future where doomsday was expected soon. Their spatial frame was the Christian oikomene, with some marginal people yet to be converted. Already Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the fathers of this genre, worked out a set of concordance tables that for the first time synchronized the several concurrent chronologies in use at his time with different peoples. Universal chronicles were sometimes organized around a central ideological theme, such as the Augustine idea of the tension between the heavenly and the earthly state. Universal chronicles commonly used a periodization scheme like the Ages of Men or the Six Ages or the Four Kingdoms, very popular in the Middle Ages. These periodization schemes generally share a pessimistic outlook and consider the present as the very last period before the end of all history. The historians of the Enlightenment skipped the notion of a providential succession of ages or kingdoms, and they skipped the idea of an end of history in the near future. Their world history, in German Weltgeschichten, were meant to be decidedly secular. Their so-called philosophical histories of mankind used as a fundamental concept the progress of reason and the move towards a civil society under the law, either as an empirical process like Voltaire, or as a necessary but unprovable guiding idea like Kant. Their visions of transforming an aggregate of unrelated events and histories into a coherent narrative system of one world history had, notwithstanding its Eurocentric bias, a decidedly universalist and cosmopolitan outlook. Consider Kant's title of 1784, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose. The long 19th century saw the abandonment of the cosmopolitan and universal outlook in favor of national perspectives. Today I will not talk about the rise and fall of the various philosophies of history, but I should hint that the institutions and the professional standards of historical scholarship were developed during the 19th century in the field of national or nationalistic historical scholarship and national historiography. So, and the lasting consequence is that in professional circles there is still a certain contempt of world history as collections of history's light or as the occupation of gifted dilettanti. This is a tricky point, and maybe we can get out of it by intercultural cooperation. Global history. The early modern concepts of world history were developed at the same time as the discovery of and the encounters with Asia and Americas grew in number and impact. Remember, Voltaire started his world history not with Europe but with long chapters on China. The new global history did not start with historical globalization. The term globalization became common only in the 1980s, as you know, and was originally used to describe the diminishing importance of national borders as barriers of international exchange and the growing importance of an international market of labor, capital, and commodities. The new global history focused ex post on these developments and set them in long-term perspectives. One of the widely discussed issues is the question, when did globalization begin, and what by implication is a meaningful starting point for global history and eventually teaching global history? There are various and competing options. You might treat globalization and global history as a quite recent phenomenon. You might start in the late 19th century with industrialization, with imperialism, with universal time zones, and so on. Then you state a slowdown after 1914 and a new going on after World War II. Or even later in the 1980s, when you focus on integrated system of production, outsourcing, deregulation, transport communications, and global environment problems. To quote an extreme position by Bruce Maslish from 1993, global history is contemporary history. It deals with current earth-spanning processes. Global history includes the formation and development of global communities, ideas and concepts, values with universal aims, such as human rights, planetary identities, and widely understood forms of communications, such as international language and music. You might go quite another way and treat globalization as a phenomenon with a very long history. You might start with the trade links between the Sumer culture and the Indus Valley civilization in the 3rd millennium before Christ. You might start with the Mediterranean trade system between India and Spain in the Hellenistic world, and later on in the Roman world, extending even to Han China. You might talk of the history of the Silk Road, the emergence of the cosmopolitan culture in the sense of a city culture, not a worldwide culture, a city culture. You might start with the Islamic trade system in the Islamic Golden Age from the 8th to the 13th century. You might start with an Euro-Central Asian world system. It is the trade system under the shelter of Pax Mongolica, mentioned by Claudio Zanier, which saw the transmission not only of goods but also of diseases. And thirdly, which is, in my impression, the most common way today, you might start with the age of explorations and discoveries since the late 15th century, connecting Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, and you might point out that only then started a quantitatively really substantial exchange. Then you will talk about the rise of maritime empires, of the Columbian exchange, of migrations of settlers, of slave trade, of the exchange of crops, corn, cereals, cotton, and many other things. And there are nowadays attempts to subdivide these processes of globalization in at least three distinct periods: archaic globalization, proto-globalization, and modern globalization. But whatever starting point in these periodization patterns you choose to organize research and or teaching, it's obvious that your spatial and temporal reference is Europe or the Western world. And this is criticized and limited in many, very many contributions, and there are numerous pleas to overcome Eurocentrism in conceptualizing world or global history in a non-Eurocentric way. And in my opinion, this is my central argument, this is the real challenge of modern world or global history. Eurocentrism is an outspoken but more often implicit belief in the European model of modernization, of rationalization as an unavoidable way into the modern world, in the universal validity of European norms and values. It has in the issue of, for example, in the issue of human rights, freedom of opinion, and so on. It's easy to skip old notions of the type the white man's burden, of people without history, of triumphalist or exceptionalist tales of superiority, of young rising nations, of dependent nations at the periphery enriching the core nations in the centers. But the problem of Eurocentrism raises far more difficult epistemological questions. Any terminology that selects Europe and its geographic reference point obviously carries value judgments: non-European, non-Western, third world, rest of the world, Oriental, developing countries, and many more. And it has been pointed out that Eurocentrism has never been truly European, but always was culturally dominated by very few dominating European nations. Maybe we simply can't avoid to use Europe or the West not as a geographical or historical political reference, but as a historical construct for heuristic reasons, and to describe certain institutional arrangements and professional standards in historical scholarship and historiography. The CLIOHWORLD project will not bring a solution to all these problems involved, but it could contribute to raise the awareness of history teachers of all the traps, quite well known but difficult to avoid. It seems that the goal, our goal, can be described by a famous phrase saying provincializing Europe or decentering Europe by integrating contending conceptions of historiography and at the same time to stick to certain professional standards and to practice a kind of, quote, soft Eurocentrism, always conscious and always transparent in regard to its ideological, political, and cultural foundations. Thank you for today.